This further alienates us from power. This further creates the divide from the given interests of any individual who is forced to submit to government power and the laws that actually get made and are applied to them. But the disconnect is in the very structure of representational democracy itself. The fact is that any given voter has no power over the state, no direct power over the state that rules him. He is completely at the mercy of the power of the state, whether he votes or not. We choose our government. That is going to be the question that we are going to be focusing on today. This comes out of our last video where I talked about whether or not we need government, whether or not we need states to achieve things like security and freedom and prosperity for society as a whole. And I came to the conclusion that not only do we not need states and governments in order to achieve this, but actually states represent history's greatest destroyer of these. Now, even though governments and states are historically the enemy of freedom and rights and security, it may be argued that they are nonetheless chosen, that perhaps states and governments do a horrible job at providing society with the things it needs, but still, don't we choose it? Don't we vote for it? Don't we live in a free society? And doesn't our government live by the consent of the governed? In essence, even if the state is a failure at actually providing us what we need, isn't that really our own fault? Isn't that the consequences of our own choices, not the consequences of something being imposed upon us without our decision or say or choice? And that's essentially what we're going to be examining today. Do we choose our governments, or are they forced upon us? Are they imposed upon us? And throughout this video, we are going to be limiting the examination to representational democracies in particular, mostly because on the one hand, this is the form of government that is most popular, especially in the West. And so it's what most Western people are familiar with when they think of a government. But also it might be argued that in something like a representational democracy, we have the power to vote and we have a direct say in what our government does. Whereas this doesn't seem very clear when it comes to things like dictatorships and monarchies, more explicit oligarchies. It's basically to say that if we can show that representational democracies aren't a form of choice either, then it follows that the other forms of government, which tend to be more authoritarian, are also forms of involuntary government, unchosen. So we'll be limiting our examination just to the structure of representational democracies and asking whether that actually produces a government that we choose. The structure of this video is going to be going through 4 arguments that are usually given for the idea that we choose our government: voting and representation, and the fact that we vote for our presidents, we vote for people who represent us in government. Doesn't this imply that we have some say in our government? The second thing we're going to tackle is social contract theory. This is perhaps the most popularly taught political and philosophical justification for why contemporary governments are actually the result of the consent of the governed. And we'll examine that in more detail. The fourth argument is a sort of you can just leave argument. This is the idea that, well, if you don't like the government that you have, you can kind of just get up and move somewhere else. You don't have to submit yourself to the government because governments allow people to immigrate and emigrate. So doesn't the fact that you can just leave a country mean that you sort of implicitly consent to it? And the last major thing we're going to tackle is the idea of implied consent. When something like social contract theory doesn't work anymore, people often will bring up the idea of implied consent. And we'll get into what implied consent is and whether it can be applied to the state or not. So we're going to go through each of these ones one by one. I'm going to offer you my general counter arguments to each of these justifications for the idea that we choose our governments. There's a general picture as to why I think each of these arguments fails. But this certainly will not be comprehensive, as that would be pretty much impossible to do without making this video hours and hours long. But as always, as I'm going through these, if you have any thoughts that come to your mind, any criticisms, any things you'd like to add to what I'm saying here, then I would encourage you to put it down in the comments section, and I would be happy to engage with you guys. I'd be happy to just bring this conversation further along and to see if we can't come up with a better understanding as to whether or not our governments are really our choice or not. So I'll just encourage you guys to leave any thoughts that you have down in the comments. With all that being said, we'll get right into the first major objection that tends to come up against the idea that we don't choose a government, which is the idea of the fact that we vote, the fact that we are represented, that we vote for representatives who go on to serve our interests in Congress, in the executive branch, and that these representatives further go on to appoint people in the other branches of government or in the bureaucracy in general, so that each and every person and each and every function of government power and the state is considered to be an extension of us voicing our consent through our votes. Now, in this talk, I'm going to be mostly talking about the form of representative democracy that we find in the United States, principally because that's the one that I am most familiar with since I live in the United States. I'm just not familiar enough with other kinds of representative democracy to be able to talk about it competently. But the same principle of being represented, that is one person representing perhaps thousands or tens of thousands of people who decide on who represents them based on a majority vote. This kind of principle exists in practically every representational democracies. Of course, constitutions are different here and there, and the explicit structures are different depending on which nation that you live in, but the essential principles are the same here. And I believe this examination can be extended to practically any form of representational democracy. So the first question we have to ask is, does voting for a representative to represent your interests in a government structure amount to choosing the government itself? Really, the question we're asking is, are we really represented in the system that we live in? And there are essentially two kinds of critiques that you can take here. One is asking yourself whether the system as it stands works, right? Does it actually do what it says it does? I don't think there's validity there. I mean, I could sit here and talk about how money corrupts the political process, how private interests and lobbying corrupt the ability for representatives to actually execute the interests of their constituency. You could talk about how the government itself is incentivized to monopolize its own power in greater and greater spheres. You could make a market critique of this, but ultimately all of those kinds of critiques fail because they don't address the system itself. They address the things that might go potentially wrong with the system. And my criticism of whether or not we choose our government runs deeper than just where democracy or representational democracy goes wrong, but it's to attack the idea that representational democracy amounts to consent at all. So when I ask the question, are we represented? This is not to be taken in a sense of a superficial analysis of what comes in to corrupt the process, but an analysis of the process itself. When I think about consent in a normal way, it's a pretty direct relationship where the individual who is consenting has significant autonomy over the ultimate outcome of that consent, right? So I know that sounds abstract, but something as simple as a relationship. Relationships are meant to be consensual. If relationships are not consensual, many people consider that to be immoral. And the kind of consent that we're talking about in relationships is that a man goes to a woman and says, "Hey, would you like to be my girlfriend?" And she says, either, "Yes, I'd like to be your girlfriend," and they go off and have a relationship together, or she says no, and the guy backs away, right? It's consent in this idea is quite direct, and the woman in this circumstances has direct autonomy over what she's consenting to. Same thing if you go to a store and you pick out groceries, you have consent because you have direct control over the kinds of things that you're going to purchase. You have other different kinds of stores that you can go to purchase something. If somebody bought you food without your consent, this is without considering how you've actually expressed your own values to them and just sort of forced you to have whatever food that they gave to you, whether or not that related to what you value, you could hardly call that consent. So consent in the ordinary sense is very direct. It's very autonomously focused. And I don't see this kind of consent being produced in this system of representation. And we'll try to start this from the bottom up, right? If you take any given election of a representative, let's say this one representative is supposed to represent 10,000 people. And let's say that this representative gets voted in by that 10,000 people by a margin of 70% in favor, 30% opposed. Now, in a typical democracy, that kind of margin would be considered huge. This representative would be considered as having a mandate of the people to fight in Congress for whatever it is the people voted in for, or whatever it is, whatever platform he was running on. So in the case of the 70-30 vote, the candidate is seen to be overwhelmingly representing the 10,000 constituents within the group that he is representing. But this is strange to me because the very act of voting reveals, even this 70-30 split here, reveals that 30% of that population to whom he is supposed to be representing have explicitly made it clear through this vote that they don't want this person representing them at all. And yet, this person, whom the 70% of the majority have voted for, will go on to represent in Congress this entire 10,000 group people. It seems to me right off the bat that 30% of people within that 10,000 group, so you're talking 3,000 people, are directly unrepresented by the person who's being sent to Congress. Their values, their beliefs, whatever their interests are, whatever they want the state to actually do, is automatically, from the get-go, being denied by the person who is supposed to represent them. The 70% of the people who actually sent him to Congress, you might say, well, this guy must represent their interests and values then. I would challenge this notion because, of course, if you talk to any given individual within that 70%, 7,000, you have 7,000 people there, the reason that any given person within that 7,000 would have for voting for this person are going to be dramatically different given the diversity of the people involved. And it's not at all clear that the interests of any given person who voted for this guy to represent them is actually in accordance with what that guy ultimately wants to do, or even what he proposed, right? So, an example of this is something like, how many people in the United States in the last election who voted for Donald Trump were voting for Donald Trump not because they valued Donald Trump, but because they hated Joe Biden, or vice versa. It's not at all clear to me that when somebody votes for a person, that they are voting for the actual platform of the person, that what that person goes on to do in government is actually a reflection of what the person who voted for them actually valued. The group of people who have voted for a person, their individual interests are not necessarily the reasons why they voted for this person. What this person represents is not any given individual's interest or values or idea of what kind of government they want. It is, you might say, an amalgamation of the abstracted values of the group that don't fit neatly with any given person who actually voted for said person. So that's one level of difficulty that you have. But this isn't where the difficulties end. There's another layer of abstraction. There's another layer removed from the actual interest of the given person who votes. Because this representative then goes on to, say, Congress, for example, to vote on legislation with a bunch of other congressmen. Now, each of these other people's races have resulted in the same thing over and over again. Some portion of the population that voted in that election have explicitly stated that the person who's being sent to Washington to represent them does not represent them at all. And then the people who have voted for that person, any given individual in that group is not necessarily directly represented by the person they sent to Congress. But now the actual legislation or the bills that get passed, the laws that get passed, are also not a direct representation of what any given congressman values or any given congressman is there to promote in Congress. It is the amalgamation of all of the congressmen, whatever they can agree upon, whatever they can negotiate about. And again, not all of them, but only the majority, only a certain percentage. Even, I think, if you get rid of the filibuster, it's something like either 60 or 70% or something like that. So at any given vote for any given bill, you have millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people directly expressing a negation of what is being passed by government that is going to go on to be applied and forced on everybody else. There's two levels of abstraction between the person who actually voted and whatever law gets passed. And that's only if you're talking about, representatives in one house. If you add the Senate, now you have another 2 layers of abstraction there, another 2 layers of alienation there. And then if the Congress and the Senate both pass a bill jointly, which is whatever the bill is, it's not going to be representative of anybody's interest, direct interest who actually participated in it. This now gets passed on to the president, who is also voted for in an indirect way, but let's say he's voted for. And especially when it comes to the presidents, the margins are so incredibly small as to be, it's almost always some level of 50-50. And then the president decides whether to veto or pass a law, and if he vetoes it, it can go back through the House of Representatives and the Senate. But the point is to say, and what I'm really outlining here, is that though we claim this is a representational system, that implies the consent of the governed, that is, the idea that voting represents the consent of the governed, is really ludicrous. Because the connection between whatever law gets passed and enforced and how it gets enforced and how it actually impacts any given individual, and that individual's influence or input being a part of the creation of that law, is so alienated and so abstracted and so disconnected to be hardly anything at all. And so how can you say that any given individual, by the fact that they can vote, has agreed to the way in which the government actually goes about executing power? There is such a disconnect there that I'm not even sure how you could connect the two in any sort of direct way. And this is, of course, before the more superficial kinds of things that get in the way of this so-called democratic process, like corruption, money, lobbying, historical incentives, politicking, power. There's, of course, the whole question as to whether or not we really get a choice over candidates, or whether it's, just Republican and Democrat. This further alienates us from power. This further creates the divide from the given interest of any individual who is forced to submit to government power and the laws that actually get made and are applied to them. But the disconnect is in the very structure of representational democracy itself. The fact is that any given voter has no power over the state, no direct power over the state that rules him. He is completely at the mercy of the power of the state, whether he votes or not. And that kind of mercy, that kind of subjugation, is radically different from how we use the word consent or choice in a daily given context. It's radically different from when a girl chooses a relationship with a man, or you choose to go to the store and buy your food, or you choose what career you're going to pursue, or you choose what book you're going to read next. These are radically different in practice than how they are often talked about. And I really can't see how you can derive consent or choice from the idea of a vote. But I would say that there is even a deeper problem here, which is the question of whether or not the presence of voting would justify force and violence. If the state is force-based and violence-based, Does the fact that a person get a vote in this process necessarily mean that he consents? This is kind of similar to an analogy I've heard before, but it's something like if a mafia rules your town, right, and some mafia thugs come up to you in the middle of the night and surround you in a circle and say, we're going to vote on whether or not to take your wallet. And you said, well, no, I don't. I think that's wrong. You shouldn't take my wallet. They're going to say, no, don't worry about it. We're going to vote on it. Everybody votes on it and they vote to take your wallet. And then you object to them taking your wallet and they say, no. You had a choice in all this because we gave you a vote. You can sort of see the ludicrousness in an analogous way of the idea that just because voting is present doesn't mean that voting implies consent or certainly choice, especially if the system was there and imposed from the get-go. And we'll get more into that later. So voting itself, even if we admit that voting is is somehow an equivalent choice to other kinds of choices that we have in our lives, does the presence of voting actually end up justifying the violence that has already been there or not? It's a question to consider. And then the other aspect of this that I would challenge is the idea of a government being justified by the consent of the people, because of course there's masses of the population who either directly live within a nation or are affected by a nation that have no power to vote. And the two main ones that I can think of here is children, in particular the fact that they are widely educated by the state and therefore propagandized by the state and the current government that happens to be in power, but also foreigners, again, who are affected by state power. I mean, the state arbitrarily today is defining who's an immigrant and who is not, and immigrants are being categorically affected by the power of the United States without having a choice or having a vote in whether or not they're affected. So does this same moral logic apply to them? Think about the people in the Middle East, innocent people who are being killed, whose homes are being destroyed, whose civilization is being destroyed by the United States government and its power, who obviously have no power to vote as to whether or not the United States can use this power against them in this kind of way. Does this same sort of moral justification apply to them? Do we have the moral legitimacy to attack these people without giving them a vote? And if not, why is the moral legitimacy of voting only the privilege of the people who happen to be born in a certain geographical area? Why is there not a universal application of this moral rule? We'll get into this a little bit later, but I truly think that this idea of voting is just an ideological justification to excuse state power. When the government violates your rights, when the government uses force and violence against you, when the government destroys your business or your home, when the government jails you for victimless crimes, and you protest, the people around you and the government itself can say, well, you had a vote in this, and so therefore you agreed to the rules that we have laid out, even though you don't value them, they're of no interest to you. And this is used as a sledgehammer to justify the force and violence of the state against the individual because they were given the right to vote. I think this is an ideological cover-up to justify the use and abuse of power in a structural way. And people accept it because they've been taught to by the same government that funds their early childhood education and teaches them their Civics 101 class. But speaking of Civics 101, we can start needling into the idea of social contract theory, which happens to be, I think, the most popular justification for, philosophically speaking, for the existence of the state itself and it being based in the consent of the people. Now, social contract theory originally came out of the Enlightenment movement philosophically. This is people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau. And essentially the idea was these theorists were trying to figure out, why did governments come about in the first place? Why is there this universal phenomena of governments, of monopolizations of power that is invested in security and infrastructure and the supposed social need? Really, the story that they made up was that before there were governments, there was a primordial stage of competing individuals who were at each other's throats and who were isolated and who were unable to work with one another without a unifying organizing principle like state violence. And so a group of them at some point must have gotten together and voluntarily handed over certain rights and freedom, like being free from taxation or being free from police power. Essentially, they gave over some significant portion of their individual autonomy, and they handed it over either to a king or to the government or to the state in order to better organize and coordinate society for the benefit of all individuals. And this is given as a basis for why the state ought to be directly controlled by the citizens, and it often gave rise, especially through John Locke, through arguments for representational democracy. But the state exists for the sake of the people. And most importantly, for what we're talking about today, it came out of people voluntarily giving up a certain amount of autonomy over to the government or to the state in order to organize society in a better way that was deemed socially necessary by everybody involved. But really, in the first place, this is just a new sort of divine right of kings. When the monarchies had power, the excuse for why the monarch had all the power was given to them by the theologians at the time, who said that God had put the king there on purpose to rule over the people so that they wouldn't devolve into chaos and anarchy. And so the king ruled not because he dominated through force and violence, but because he was put there by God. And so if God did it, it must be good, and therefore the king's monopoly on violence to the state is also good, and you shouldn't question it. As the monarchy was falling apart and democracies were on the ride, they needed a new principle to justify, a new story to justify the monopolization of the use of violence against the anarchist theorists and the more libertarian theorists out there who are arguing, why do we need a state at all? Why does the state get to have this monopolization of power at all? And this was the story they came up with, social contract theory, as a new paradigm to replace the old paradigm of the divine right of kings. But of course, this was entirely made up. There was no primordial situation in which all people came together to voluntarily give up some sort of autonomy of their own in order to promote violent control over what is deemed socially necessary. The real story of our history's past is one of domination, and those who had access and control over power were able to use it to subjugate and dominate masses of people, both through direct physical force and violence, but also through ideology and coercive structure. And so social contract theory was entirely bogus. There was no voluntarily giving up of power, and the state was never about helping the so-called mass citizens. The state was designed to dominate citizens, and the state continues to exist to dominate citizens for the benefit of its own bureaucracy. It's gotten better and more efficient at fooling the citizens into working for it and to feeling free. We're sort of free-range cattle rather than the caged cattle, but this does not change the situation of dominance that exists. And beyond that, I think the real death nail of something like the social contract theory is that even if you had a primordial situation in which our ancestors gave up some portion of their rights or autonomy for the sake of the violence of the state, why would this apply to us today? I'm not my ancestors living thousands of years ago. I'm me today in relationship to a dominating state. Why would this supposed contract, which I was not a part of, I didn't get to generate, I didn't get to consent to, why would this past contract have any binding on my choice and decisions and values today? This theory ultimately was just a way of post-justifying the violent domination that was already existing and in place in order to perpetuate it in a new way, rather than allowing people to wake up to the realization that they were being dominated to begin with. And so we clearly don't choose our government through voting and representational system. We certainly don't choose our governments because some past group of people decided to hand over power to the state for us. But nonetheless, don't we have the right to choose, don't we have the right to leave? And doesn't this right to leave our country imply that we must have a choice in staying, and therefore a choice in what we're subjected to, right? If we don't like our government, if we don't like our laws, if we don't like the way the system works, if we don't like the rules of the game, can't we just pick up and move somewhere else that suits us better, and therefore exercise our choice by the fact that we can leave? And there's a couple things here. One, the ability to leave was not already always historically the case when it comes to states and governments. You can argue today that we have a greater ability to leave than we ever have, though that leaving is not as straightforward, of course, as it's often argued, especially since World War One and World War II. Leaving and emigrating to another country is exceedingly difficult and costly and expensive. But the question, does the ability to leave imply consent over the situation or a choice over the situation that one finds oneself in? And I think even more subtly than that, does it justify the violence and the force that's being inflicted on the people who are here? And to talk about this, I would use a parallel example here of something like domestic abuse, just to get to the idea of where I'm coming from in criticizing this argument. And the situation of a person who's being domestically abused is often psychologically one, and financially one, in which they're married to a person who is using violence and force against them in a clearly immoral way. And they don't get up and leave. For one reason or another, they stay with this person and they endure the violence. It can often be because they're afraid of the consequences. They're unsure of if they leave, what's going to happen to them. They might not have the financial means to be able to do so. There is an environment of both psychological and physical control that, the husband is using against the wife in a situation like that, even if she does technically have the ability to leave. And there's two questions I would ask about that situation, which is, one, it would be pretty silly to say to her, well, you should just leave. But it would be silly to say that she is choosing the situation with her husband because she has yet to leave that situation that she's in, because there's all kinds of things that will make it very difficult for her to leave. But even more than this, the fact that she could leave, even if she has really the choice to leave, would not justify the kinds of physical abuse that the husband is using against her. It doesn't sort of retroactively justify the violence that has already been applied to her. And if you take this same kind of thinking and you apply it between the citizen and the state, I think you can see where I'm coming from this. In the first place, it is difficult and costly to leave, and it is not something that the United States government sort of easily just provides you the means to be able to do. There are millions of the people in this country, because of the circumstances which the state has created for them, who do not have the means to leave this country for another. There are plenty of people in this country who would like to leave the United States and do not have the means to be able to. And that's the case in many countries across the world. Secondly, you have to ask yourself the question, if I leave this state of force and violence, where am I going to go? Because no matter where you go, it's just another state of violence in more or less degrees. If the person in an abusive relationship, if the only places they could go was to other situations of abuse and violence and force, this wouldn't really be much of a choice for them. And the same thing is true when it comes to leaving this country to go to another country. Every country is a monopolization of force and violence, the presence of a government where there is not the consent of the people who are ruled over. Different nations might have different degrees of freedom based on what the government deems effective to give the people, but the fundamental structure of violence and force is universal across every single nation. And so it's not as simple as saying you can just leave when the only other options that you have to go to are other force-based states. Similarly, the fact that I have the ability or the choice to go to a different country or go to another state of violence does not in and of itself justify the force and violence that the United States or whatever government that you live in has inflicted on its people already. Especially when you think about children. You do not even have the right to vote until you're 18, and yet the government in the state, at least in the United States, you don't have a right to vote until you're 18, and yet the state and the government dramatically affects you throughout those 18 years in ways that you have absolutely no control or power over. So the ability to leave, even if one has the ability to leave, which again, the vast majority of people I would say don't or would really struggle with doing that, does not necessarily imply choice. It doesn't address the fundamental monopoly of violence that exists within the state. The last one we'll tackle here is this notion of implied consent. And I'm not quite clear on what people are talking about when they're talking about this. I've mostly heard this in relationship to something like a business. So maybe you guys can enlighten me. And if you have a further understanding of this, you can put it down in the comments. But the idea is something like this. If I'm going to go down to my local grocery store, I don't sign a contract with the grocery store stipulating the rules that I need to follow in that grocery store before I can enter, right? The store has policies, you could say, that this private business has policies that I could have access to if I wanted to, but I don't need to sign a contract to go into their store. And it would seem ludicrous and frankly immoral if just because I stepped on their private property that they were able to use force and violence against me because they had not given me explicit permission to step on their property. And there's something about the nature of a business that implies the fact that a person can walk in there freely and buy things and is going to act in a certain way within that store such that if they act up, the store is able to kick them out, but they don't need explicit permission to be a part or go get groceries, right? There's a tacit consent, right? And somehow this gets tacked on to the state, that the state exists, and because the state exists and you sort of interact with it, that there is this tacit agreement of the state employing power over you. I don't really know how the argument falls, and it's kind of confusing sometimes, but I've heard this come up a lot. And what I usually say is, because I think this is the major difference, right, is that you sort of cannot escape the state like you could a business, meaning that the state is something which sort of always exists for the individual, no matter what they're doing, I suppose you could say. So sort of from the moment you're born, the state is involved in your life in a pretty direct way. Whereas it's simply not the same thing for a business. A business you could go into whether you wanted to or not. There are other options. You can sort of shop around. You can grow your own food. I mean, there's other ways of approaching a business. So the nature of business is that they want people to come into their stores and buy their things. And that's sort of why you have an implicit consent. You don't have to explicitly consent to going into the store. But the state is something that is imposed on people, whereas a business is not imposed on people. And I don't see anything about the nature of the state that necessarily implies automatic consent. And it just seems ludicrous at some point, because if you think about tyrannical or autocratic states, I don't think most people in the West would consider those people to be free or choosing their governments or consenting to the state that they live in, but they too are sort of within the milieu of power dominance. And so I'm not really sure how it follows that the state is there's therefore an implied consent to the state. I just hear this argument a lot, which is why I wanted to cover it. But again, if you can explain it, maybe you guys can explain it to me in better ways than I'm understanding it. I've just seen it brought up a lot, and that's why I want to address. But anyway, that's going to be the end here. What are your guys' thoughts? What are your guys' thoughts on each and every one of these topics? Do you think that maybe voting and representation really does represent choice in some way that I'm not seeing here? Or do you think there's more validity to the social contract theory than I've laid it out here, right? Are there any problems with my arguments? I'm sure there are gaps here. I'm sure there are things I haven't touched upon or I'm not explaining. Is there anything here that you think you could expand upon? I would just love to know your thoughts about. anything that I said in this video. And I would love to respond to you guys, learn more from you guys, and just generate that philosophical discussion that can get us, thinking deeper about these important kinds of concepts. The next video that we're going to do is it's not going to be an answering objections video. This will probably be the last one of that for a while until new stuff comes up or comes to my mind. But one of the things that I can't help notice from all these different arguments is that they appear to me to be rather thin. And perhaps it's because I'm stupid and I don't really understand what people are arguing in these cases. And that certainly may well be the case, but it often appears to me that arguments for the voluntariness of the state or the consensual nature or the choice of government is rather thin. And this has often led me to the question, well, why do people buy these kinds of arguments? It seems so rationally thin to develop to defend the abstract notion of government, where, people aren't stupid in general, right? I mean, people think deeply about other areas of their life, but they sort of don't apply this thinking as much to the nature of the state and the nature of government. And I've always sort of wondered why. I've got some thoughts about that. I think it's related to parenting. And so I think the next video we're going to do is going to be on parenting the state. So I hope you'll be around to watch that one. But if you like this video so far, then please give it a like. If you found this information to be helpful, you think somebody else would benefit from this information, please share it with them. Again, comment, guys, if you guys have any thoughts, any criticisms, anything to add to anything that I've been saying. I'd love to have these kinds of conversations with you. And if you want more videos like this, then please subscribe for more. But as always, thank you so much, guys, for listening, and I will talk to you next time.